Yeah, so and I appreciate you coming on to try to get a real vacation, but you can't get a real vacation when free agency starts, Luke. Come on now.
No, well, that's.
I'm just saying. I mean, you probably were loving that Twitter had a rate limit that was exceeded because you couldn't really keep up what's going on. But as we've come out of that haze and we're getting a better idea of what the Canes roster is going to look like, there's some loose threads that have everybody kind of like, I need the hit. Give me some more news on Tarasenko. What's going on, Luke? So I guess we need like the too long didn't read version. There was an initial report that the speculation was that Tarasenko was going to sign with the Carolina Hurricanes. But then, Adam say, hey, there's no deal in place. I know you're aware of this as well. And then all of a sudden, last night I'm seeing he's got a change in agent representation. So everything resets. What is going on?
I mean, I think you summed it up. He had offers. There was at some point some agent or someone told somebody that he was going to take the Hurricanes offer. Obviously, he didn't, or that was inaccurate. There never was a formal deal in place. And, he sort of looked at the offers in totality and said, I want to hire new agents and start over. I don't like this. I think what happened is, I thought Tarasenko was the player the Hurricanes needed at the deadline. The Rangers beat them to him.
Okay. At the right
I thought he really was, you look at, he's on the downside of his career. He's erratic. His analytics aren't as good as they used to be. But I thought he could help the Hurricanes because he can score goals. And I think he would have helped the Hurricanes. I think he would have helped them, give them some more scoring depth, especially when, Teravainen got hurt. That's a guy who can kind of help you on the wings there. But I don't know how much he helps them now, to be honest. I think if you add Tarasenko, what you're doing is bolstering your roster so you can move a different piece, which is probably, Teravainen because he's got 1 year left on his deal. But this stuff happens. It happened last year with Mason Marchment. The rumor was he'd signed with the Hurricanes, and then 6 hours later, he actually signed in Dallas. And it was credible people saying Mason Marchment has agreed to terms with the Hurricanes. And man, you want to do some retconning there. Mason Marchment on the Hurricanes last year, he was everything they were missing. He's got snarl. He can score goals. He's a finisher. He would have been incredible. So, that was a huge opportunity that missed. Now they ended up doing other things, and that's fine. That's the way it works sometimes. But, this is the kind of thing that happens. And quite frankly, in a rumor-based business, which is what hockey free agency is, everybody racing to be first. And sometimes, someone jumps the gun and someone else shoots them down, and maybe they're both right.
Speaking of changing agents, Pesce, new agent. Noticeably, we have not seen a new deal for him. Is the 1 year left? What do you suspect now with Orlov in the fold? What do you suspect happens with Pesce?
Yeah, there's a couple things that can happen here. One is I love the idea of the Hurricanes playing with all those guys, with Slavin and Burns and Shea and Pesce and Orlov, because Orlov's deal, while very large in the short term, is not a long-term deal. It retains the flexibility they needed. And people I don't think understand how good Orlov is. This reminds me of last year when people were like, wow, Brent Burns and Tony DeAngelo kind of had the same number of points. Isn't this just aren't they downgrading because he's older? And it's like, dude, this is not apples and oranges. This is like apples and camels. Like, there's no comparison between Tony DeAngelo and Brent Burns. They're barely playing the same sport, let alone the same position. But people were legitimately hand-wringing, like, can Brent Burns replace Tony DeAngelo? And I know this is kind of like the Twitter meme about there's some guy on Twitter saying, I saw Tony Steph Curry can't shoot. But there were people who were legitimately concerned because I got their emails and they were in my mentions. And I was telling them, no, this is
significant,
tectonically difficult. Yeah. And it's the same thing like Orlov. Nothing against Shane Gostisbehere, who I thought was better than his reputation. And, he wasn't great, but he wasn't a huge liability. Added something to the second power play. Not that the power play was great. But going from Shane Gostisbehere to Dmitry Orlov, who does a little bit of everything really well, and not being linked to him for the long term, so you don't have this sort of long tail baggage with him. I'd love to see him go through with those five guys in Jalen Chatfield because they can. They have the cap flexibility to do it.
Yeah, they can do that.
I think in the long term, though, you're going to move either Shea or Pesce this summer because you're not going to be able to re-sign both of them long term. And Pesce's the one who makes the most sense. He's more valuable as a right shot defenseman for one thing. Yeah. But he's also there's less tread on his tires. He's been beat up a little bit over the years. He's had some surgeries. He plays a little rougher game, gets hurt a little more. So I think he's the one you're gonna try to move if you can't re-sign him to a deal that you like, and obviously they haven't been able to do that. But they also have interest in Erik Karlsson, who plays no defense whatsoever, but is an absolute offensive. I mean, this is a guy who just won the Norris Trophy, despite being a complete liability in his own end. He's that good. He's like Sandis Ojelej, but what Sandis Ojelej was supposed to be. Not that the Hurricanes should be going and trading for offense first defenders like that, but
jeez.
Joe appreciates it though. He's a big Ozelin fan. But they have the flexibility then to do something like that if San Jose retains a bunch of salary. But Joe, do you have?
I'm dying.
Raising the finger.
No. Go ahead. You're gonna love my next point.
Okay. But and it's the same thing with Teravainen. If you don't think you're going to re-sign him, or you don't think you can re-sign him, now is the time to trade him for the most value. I would love to see them go through the season with those 6 guys on defense. I think that's almost impregnable. And then if a guy gets hurt, you basically not only have the deepest defense in the league, you have the deepest defense in the league minus one of those guys. And it just gives you, I think that would just be amazing. But, I think they still need to upgrade at center. I don't know that KK is necessarily the guy you want to be counting on there, especially with the odometer ticking on Jordan Staal. And that means maybe having to give something up. So, I think the Pesce situation is the same as Teravainen. You're in a position where you've got to make a decision now or risk losing them for nothing. And that's just part of the sport. And with Pesce and Shea, you could end up trading both those guys if you don't think you can re-sign them long-term at a reasonable number. If you have guys to replace them. So, the addition of Orlov creates the flexibility to make those moves. If they trade Pesce right now, as long as they can add a decent guy, they're not hurting themselves, because Orlov, despite being a left shot, does just give them that elite blue liner that helps you there. Sorry. All right, Joe, I got to hear what you got to say.
Yeah. So the hockey season ends this year, the playoffs, Canes go out, and your first column after it ending, you're like, hey man, the Canes, they got to get a little bit tougher, got to get a little grittier, got to add a little sandpaper, right? I'm correctly summarizing.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's going to be a little nasty.
Your first postmortem column.
Yeah.
Okay. Back in the day, the Canes under Jim Rutherford, who had an effing jihad against you, would have never done what you said to do, ever. Okay. Over the 4th, I see Canes signed Michael Bunting. And listen, I don't follow hockey, obviously, as much as you do. I have a cursory knowledge of hockey. You've always known this. So I'm looking up Bunting, and I'm looking up, oh, okay. Well, now, wait a second. He's in the top 10 in penalty man. Well, now, I'm slightly worried that he's got some CJ Leslie in him from high school, right? Hey, man, I played with John Wall. Okay. I'm slightly worried about that Austin Matthews part. But now I'm thinking about it. I'm like, wait a second. They did exactly what Luke told them to do. Mm-hmm. Rutherford hated you so much that out of spite, he never would have done something like that.
Have gone and signed some stuff.
I have to give and you credit for being like, hey, here's something that would make sense for the Canes to do. Yeah. And then the team, instead of being like, well, no, we can't do that because Luke doesn't want us to do that, does the smart thing.
It's funny. The funny thing is, though, Joe, and look, I have a great relationship with Rod. It's not, he and I are, and Jimmy and I had a gooder plate relationship. We were combative, but if you're doing that job right, like you were with Debbie, like the story you just told, you do go back and forth about stuff. And Debbie would never have done anything that you said she should do. In the million, just for that reason alone. And that's fine. That's the way it works sometimes. But I think, didn't Rod go on with you guys and say we don't need to get tougher? Like, wasn't that his? Didn't he tell you guys
well, he was worried about fake tough.
He was worried about fake tough. He was worried about
fake tough. No, all right, that's fine. But I mean, some people in Toronto would say that Michael Bunting is fake tough because he draws a lot of penalties.
Yeah.
And then when that became a deal, when he became the penalty drawer in the Toronto media, the refs stopped calling those penalties, which is great. You're bringing in a guy to Carolina who's concerned he's getting a bad deal from the refs. What can go wrong in this market with a guy like that? But he does. And Orlov too. Orlov's a tough little
nut.
Tough little nut. Yeah,
let's bring it all together. Let's bring it all together, Luke.
They did address some of that, to be sure. And the other thing Michael Bunting does, and Joe, I think it's the opposite of CJ and John Wall. He scores goals. I mean, not a ton, but he scores goals. And he knows how to play with good players. He's a great third wheel. Mm-hmm. He has a lot of experience being the guy who goes and gets the puck. He has a lot of experience being the guy who stands in front of the net and gets hit with someone else's shot. And honestly, isn't that what the Hurricanes really need? Is like a Stefan Nason who can skate, who can get in the way and just go do those things. And Jordan Martinook does some of that. Yeah. They just needed more of that. And again, we have to say this every time because people lose the plot. It has nothing to do with fighting, right? Fighting's irrelevant. You don't want Ryan Reeves, whatever. I mean, the Rangers had Ryan Reeves on their rosters 2 years ago, and it wasn't like the Hurricanes were cowering in fear. He had no impact on that series whatsoever. It was the other 19 Rangers skaters who beat him, really the one in net. But it's not about fighting, but you got to be able to stand up for yourself. And that's why, to me, the pivotal moment for the Hurricanes, and it was too late against the Panthers, was the cup check.
Yeah.
At the end of which was the second period of game 4,
right?
First period of game 4, whichever period it was. That was the only time in that entire series they were the aggressor.
Yeah.
And they dominated that game from that point on. And, they dominated the other 3 games too, but they needed more of that. This idea that we're going to play the right way and be rewarded, it doesn't work. I mean, it works sometimes, but you're putting so much in the hands of other people and chance. I think you got to take a stupid penalty once in a while just to kind of do it. And, they did a little of that against the Devils more. They were a little feistier in the Devils series. The Islanders were the feistier team. They showed a little more spunk in the Devils series, and then they didn't show any against the Panthers. None.
Yeah.
And Radko Gudas is punching Jack Drury in the face along the boards, and everybody's just kind of standing around going, you can't do that. What you're doing is illegal. That's illegal. What you're doing is illegal.
Officer.
I did think
that's the guy on the boat at Weekend at Bernie's. When
yeah. I did think it was notable, Luke, that the only other players who had the goal scoring prowess as Bunting were the Tkachuk brothers. In terms of penalty minutes, when I looked at the list, I was like, "Oh, well, this
anti-Lady Bing winners."
Yeah, like wait a second, yeah, this is the guy who just beat the Canes. Oh, interesting.
Well, we'll close on this. Are you ready for the Galaxy brain take that's eventually going to take hold in the regular season? If let's say they go out and get Tarasenko, or the Karlsson thing comes through, they go out and get a proven goal scorer, which is what they want. Isn't that that's what this whole offseason's about, right? We got to go get that dude. Isn't that what it's about?
No. I think the whole offseason's about is run it back. I think you go back to what Dundon said right after it is we should have beat the Panthers. Let's keep this group together, upgrade a couple spots, but let's do it again. We brought back Freddie. We brought back Rance. We got Peter back in net. We got 3 goalies for the price of 1.5. We're gonna bring back all of our forwards so far for the most part.
See, I think it's a run it back plus some not upgrades, but doing the outsmarting the room thing that Dundon likes to do as the owner of the Carolina Hurricanes with Tulski. Okay, where that's where the Tony DeAngelo obsession comes into play, right?
Yeah, to me that's a different thing. I think
with Pesce, they're in the same boat. They have in their head I appreciate the Canes. They're very upfront about what they think when it comes to these things. They think you're worth X. And if you're not down with that, well, then by all means go somewhere else. And it goes back to that conversation we had with Rod too, where he talks about people, I got more money, but I miss being here. So that's where you get a little bit of that hometown discount that's come through here. I just feel like there's still one big move they want to make.
Yeah, no, and I said earlier, I still think there's an upgrade at center.
Okay.
I still think for this team to really, but that's not necessarily that goal scorer. I mean, honestly, you get Svechnikov back, you add Bunting, goal scoring, and then you add Orlov, who is not a big point producer, but generates a lot of offense analytically.
See, and that's what I'm getting at, analytically, and that's where the Galaxy brain take is going to come in. We're going to get to the point where somebody's going to start asking if we haven't already been there. I'm just waiting for that truly proven goal scorer that's come from somewhere else to get into Rod's system and then not produce the same way. And then people go, well, see, it's Rod's system. It's Rod's system. He's taking him as far as that's the Galaxy brain take.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think you're going to get to, if you don't add a winger who scored 35 goals in this league, it's going to be like, it's like they didn't do anything at the deadline again. They didn't do anything in free agency, even though they spent like 20.
That was last episode.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I have to admit, I'm not,
No, man, you're on vacation.
You're on vacation. Behind on,
all good.
On the season.
The other thing, too, about podcast form versus radio form is that we can repeat ourselves all the time on the radio because you got people coming in and out. You got people like 15 minutes. The problem now is like, oh, man, they're talking about this again. Skip.
Now, I'll just say this on that note, on the Galaxy brain note. I've seen a couple people say like, oh, yeah, they're going for it. Look they spent money in free agency. Like they never do that. They're going for it. And like, that's true. but like the Orlov deal's for 2 years.
Yeah.
Bunting is a very reasonable price for a guy who did what he did and kind of, I think, wanted out of Toronto. Like the D'Angelo trade, if that happens, like I'm hoping maybe Orlov means that we put this TDA thing to the side.
I think it's going to happen because they're going to trade Pesci.
Well, I mean, there's that too. But if they get Karlsson, then they don't need another right shot.
Yeah, fair.
My argument is they didn't do anything different.
Okay.
They did the same thing they always do. The same thing they're trying to do trading for D'Angelo. They're weaponizing cap space. Hey, we can't sign a bunch of guys for long-term deals because we got to re-sign Shea or Pesci, and Aho's contract kicks in next year and blah, blah, blah. All right, Dmitry Orlov will take a 2-year deal. Let's go overpay. You know, it's the same thing as trading for Patrick Marleau, buying him out and getting a first-round pick. You know, Bunting, here's a guy who maybe you overpay a hair for him, but he's exactly what you need. And Toronto can't, you know, make an attempt to re-sign him because of their cap issues. It's just the goalies. Like, hey, you know, can Freddie play 50 games? Probably not. But you put Freddie and Ronta and Peter Kochetkov together, and you get 35 to 40 out of Freddie and 25 out of Ronta.
It makes total
sense. Kochetkov. Now you got 3 goalies for $7 million. I mean, there's teams paying goalies $9-10 million. And you know, I don't know that Freddie can, you know, be a number one over the course of a season at this point in his career with his injury issues. But he showed in the playoffs he can win you a Stanley Cup. He's not the reason they lost to the Panthers, not by a long shot. He got beat by the guy in the other net, but it wasn't his fault. So, I mean, it just seems to me they're doing what they always do. They're going after distressed assets, whether that's Karlsson or Tarasenko or Tony DeAngelo again. And they're weaponizing cap space. And those are the two things this team does better than anybody.